Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Travis Wolf. I teach math here, and I'm also the board chairperson for the North Dakota chapter of the Society of Catholic Scientists. But more importantly, we're here to see Dr. Stephen Barr, who is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Delaware and the former director of its Bartol Research Institute. Dr. Barr received his PhD from Princeton University and has held research positions at the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Washington, and Brookhaven National Laboratory. Dr. Barr is a theoretical particle physicist whose research centers on grand unified theories and the cosmology of the early universe. He has written over 150 research papers, as well as the article on grand unification for the Encyclopedia of Physics. In addition to his work in physics, Dr. Barr has written and lectured widely on the relation of science and religion. Since 2000, he has served on the Advisory Council for First Things, for which he has written many articles and book reviews, and he is the author of 4 books himself. Dr. Barr was awarded the Benemerenti Medal by Pope Benedict XVI in 2007 and was elected a member of the Academy of Catholic Theology in 2010. He is also the founding and current president of the Society of Catholic Scientists. Without further ado, I give you Dr. Stephen Barr.
Just want to make sure this clicker works. Oops, it doesn't. Do I use the arrows on the thing? That works, okay. Thank you, Travis, and thank you all for coming out to hear me. So the topic I'm going to speak about is whether the human mind is reducible to physics, which may sound like a strange question at first, but I'll explain why people ask it. Now, some people think, by the way, can you hear me okay? Is this, okay, good. So some people think science is somehow opposed to religion, but it isn't. The real opponent of religion is not science, but a certain philosophy that's often called scientific materialism. Now, what is scientific materialism? Well, materialism, in philosophical terms, is the claim that only material things exist, and the ultimate reality is matter. It's also called physicalism, because that's the idea that physics ultimately explains everything. Now, scientific materialism is the claim that somehow the discoveries of modern science imply that materialism is true. Now, I'm sure you've heard about people talking about the new atheists and the growing visibility and influence of atheism. The list of well-known apostles of atheism in our time is quite long. Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Lawrence Krauss, and on and on. It's important to realize that these outspoken atheists are not just atheists. They are also materialists. In fact, it is because they are materialists, really, that they are atheists. The point is that if only matter exists, then obviously God could not exist, because God is not a material object. So materialism is much more radical than atheism. Atheism just says that God does not exist. Materialism says that nothing exists except matter in motion. That would mean that even we ourselves are nothing more than material structures composed of atoms. So what is really being debated nowadays is not only God, but also ourselves and what we really are. The ongoing battle in our culture is between 2 radically different conceptions of what a human being is. The Catholic understanding, the traditional Christian understanding, is that human beings are made in the image of God. Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, around 200 AD, one of the great theologians of the early church, explained what is meant by saying we're made in the image of God. He said, "Man is rational and therefore like God. He is created with free will and is master over his acts." Indeed, the church has always taught that reason and free will are the two powers that make us spiritual beings. It is why we are capable of love in the highest meaning of that word. Love comes from our free will. Love is not simply a feeling, as Christians understand love. It is not simply a feeling, emotion, instinct, or affection. It is the free willing of the good of the other person. Only a being who has reason and freedom can love in that sense. Now, the two spiritual powers of reason and freedom are inseparable. Each requires and presupposes the other. Free will requires that we have the power of reason because free will is the capacity to make choices for reasons, not simply on the basis of blind impulse, but on the basis of reasons having to do with what is good and true. And conversely, the power of reason presupposes that our minds are free. If our minds were not free, if they were entirely controlled by factors of a lower order, as the minds of animals are, for example, by the physics and chemistry in our brains, we could not be open to reason and to realities of a higher order, such as truth, goodness, and beauty. All this is summed up very well in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which says that a human being, in his openness to truth and beauty, his sense of moral goodness, his freedom and the voice of his conscience, finds evidence of his spiritual soul, which is irreducible to the merely material. But this traditional conception of human beings is not as plausible to many people today as it once was. Reductive theories abound that claim that human beings are nothing more than the product of biological and social evolution, of genes and the environment, of instincts and social conditioning, of the wiring of the brain and the chemistry of hormones and neurotransmitters. In other words, of purely physical factors. Our minds are nothing, it is said, but the processes going on in the enormously complex biochemical computer we call the brain. That is the materialist view. Here are two famous statements of it. Carl Sagan, who's kind of the Neil deGrasse Tyson of an earlier generation, he was an astronomer, an eminent astronomer and science writer. In one of his books, he said, "I am a collection of water, calcium, and organic molecules called Carl Sagan." And Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, said in one of his books, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Where did this view come from? It has deep historical roots. The fact that the motions of the heavenly bodies are precisely predictable led very early on to the idea that the astronomical universe is a clock-like mechanism. This was already a common idea among medieval thinkers. In the 17th century, as it became clear that terrestrial phenomena, earthly phenomena, like the ones in the heavens, are governed by precise mathematical laws, the idea began to emerge that plants, animals, and even the human body can also be understood as machines. There was a great deal of interest in the 17th century in automata, and the idea that animals and the human body, and also in the idea that animals and the human body are automata. That was the view, for example, of the great philosopher and scientist René Descartes, though he did believe that humans, unlike animals, have a spiritual soul. But the more radical thinkers of the 18th century went further. They denied the existence of the human spiritual soul and its freedom, and asserted that human beings in their entirety are mechanical. A famous book written in 1748 by Julien Offray de la Matrie had the title L'Homme Machine, or Man the Machine. Now, such extreme materialism was still very rare in the 18th century, but it has gained enormous traction in our own day. As computer technology has advanced, many people have become accustomed to the idea, popularized by science fiction, that artificial machines might eventually become as conscious and intelligent as we are. This is the natural corollary of the idea that we ourselves are just machines made of meat, in the famous words attributed to Marvin Minsky, a pioneer of artificial intelligence research. Now, many factors have contributed to this development. One was the defeat of vitalism in the 19th century. Vitalism was the idea that there's some kind of special life force that living things have. It was shown, however, that life processes are based on the same chemical elements and laws of chemistry that are found in the non-living world. This suggested that the reductive modes of explanation that had been so successful in physics would unlock eventually the secrets of biology as well, as indeed they have to a remarkable degree. And Darwin's discoveries, by showing the continuities that exist between ourselves and the lower animals, weakened belief that human beings are exceptional in any way. But a decisive shift had already occurred much earlier, around 1700, with the discoveries of Isaac Newton. Newton's laws of gravity and mechanics had two profound features. First, they were universal laws. They applied to everything. They governed everything, from the motions of the great planets to the minutest constituents of matter. The second important feature they had is they were deterministic. In this sense, they implied, Newton's laws of gravity and mechanics implied, or seemed to imply, that the state of the physical world at one time completely and uniquely determines its state at all future times. At least that is true of gravitational and mechanical phenomena. In other words, if you knew exactly where all the particles and other constituents of the physical world are and how they're moving at one time, it would be possible in principle, not in practice, but in principle, to calculate exactly from the laws of physics how they would be moving at all subsequent times. The classic statement of physical determinism was given by the great mathematical physicist Pierre-Simon Laplace in do I have that quote? Yes, here. In 1819, he said, "To an intelligence which could know all the forces by which nature is animated, and the states at some instant of all the objects that compose it, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, as well as the past, would be present to its eyes." Now, all the discoveries of physics up until the 1920s, up until the 20th century, and in particular the 1920s, seemed to support this idea of physical determinism. For example, when the complete laws of electricity and magnetism were written down by James Clerk Maxwell in the 1860s, they were seen to be as rigidly deterministic as Newton's laws of mechanics and gravity. The universality and determinism of the laws of physics gave rise to the belief that the entire physical universe is a closed system of cause and effect. This is often called this causal closure of the physical world by philosophers. According to this principle, physical events can only have physical causes. In other words, because physical causes rigidly determine how matter behaves, non-physical entities, if there even are any such things, could have no effect on the world of matter. That's the idea. Now, whether you have a spiritual soul would then be irrelevant. since it could not affect what you say, what you do, or even what is going on in your brain, because your brain, as much as the rest of your body, would be under the inflexible control of the laws of physics. Freedom of thought or will or action would be impossible. Now, you might say this was nothing new. There have been thinkers since ancient times who denied the reality of human freedom, claiming that our thoughts and deeds were governed by fate, or by the stars, or by something else, or by matter. But these ideas, ancient ideas, were the fruit of mere philosophical speculation. What made the Newtonian challenge to free will more pressing was that it came from a powerful scientific synthesis that proved its validity over hundreds of years of painstaking scientific research. This doesn't mean that scientists immediately abandoned belief in free will or in the spiritual soul. Most scientists, up until at least the mid-19th century, including Newton and Maxwell, rejected the causal closure of the physical world and the materialist picture of human beings that it entails. They were, in fact, Christians. The vast majority of scientists until the mid-19th century were Christians. They believed in free will and in the soul. Nevertheless, materialist ideas slowly gained ground. And for many people today, many thinkers today, they're axiomatic. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to sketch 5 pieces of evidence or lines of argument that suggest that there's more to the human mind than materialism can explain. Some of these are based on ordinary human experience, and some are based on profound and revolutionary developments in physics and mathematics. And that, as we'll see, one of these developments was the discovery in the 20th century that physical determinism is false. Laws of physics are not, in fact, deterministic. So, the first piece of evidence is the phenomenon of consciousness, which I will argue cannot be explained in purely physical terms. Now, even animals who lack the spiritual powers of reason and free will seem to have consciousness. So what I'm arguing is that materialism fails to account even for mental phenomena that fall far short of the spiritual level. That is one reason why some well-known philosophers who do not believe in the human spiritual soul, who are atheists, such as Thomas Nagel and David Chalmers, nevertheless reject the materialist picture of the human mind, because even though they don't believe in the spiritual soul, they recognize that materialism cannot account for consciousness. Now, instead of talking about consciousness in general, let's focus on one aspect, one kind of conscious experience, color sensation. Can physics explain this? This sensory experience that you're having. Now, let me put it another way. Does physics explain the redness of an apple? Now, many scientifically knowledgeable people would immediately say yes, of course. They would say that red light consists of electromagnetic waves in a certain range of wavelengths. They would say that physics can explain why the skin of an apple preferentially reflects light in that range of wavelengths. They would talk about the cone cells in our retinas, the visual cortex of our brain, and so on, and how these allow the human brain to distinguish light of different colors, to tell a red apple from a green apple, for example. But does all that add up to an explanation of our subjective experience of redness? It does not. A well-known philosopher, Frank Jackson, made the following argument. He said, imagine that you had a person in his thought experiment, the person's name Mary. So in the philosophical literature, it's always Mary. She was either born blind or raised in a completely black and white environment, so had never seen anything in color in her whole life. She knows all the laws of physics. So this is happening in the future when we know all the laws of physics. She knows all the laws of physics, has a complete knowledge of human physiology, of the physiology of human color perception. She knows what goes on in the visual cortex of the brain and so on. Complete knowledge and understanding of that. She would still not know what it was like to see the color red. So complete scientific knowledge would still not even allow her to know what that experience was, let alone explain it. Now, some materialists would say that this is only because, some would say that, well, we can build a device that can tell one color from another, a device that has no. That is true. You could build an engineer or physicist could build a machine that could tell a red apple from a green apple. But that machine would not have the sensory experience of color any more than a thermometer or a thermostat feels warm or cold. So that's the important distinction. It's the experience, sensory experience we're trying to explain. Now, it may be, and some materialists would say this, that if we were only able to build some very complicated device, as complicated as a human brain, not just a thermometer, a thermostat, but something very, very complex like the human brain, maybe that would have conscious experience. Well, maybe so. Maybe it would actually feel warm or cold, or have the sensory experience of red or blue. But even if that were the case, physics and chemistry would neither predict that that was the case nor be able to explain it. Why? In physics, every system, every physical system, purely physical system, is characterized, indeed defined, by a set of mathematical variables that describe what its smallest constituent parts are doing. The variables might be, for example, the positions of subatomic particles or the strengths of electric and magnetic fields and so forth. Now, how the numerical values of those variables change with time is governed by a set of mathematical rules and equations, the laws of physics. Now, most physicists, and I would include myself, or many physicists, and I would include myself, believe that if one knew the values of all the variables of some purely physical system and the laws governing them, one could, in principle, derive everything there was to know about the system's physical properties and behavior, using only the rules of mathematics and logic. This is sometimes called physical reductionism. It is a spectacular success of this kind of reductionism in explaining so much about the physical world, about the world around us, that underlies the confidence of materialists that it can explain everything. But it's obvious, I think, that it cannot explain consciousness. Even if you knew, confronted with some physical system or object, and you knew all of the variables of that system and all of the numerical values of them and had complete knowledge of the laws of physics that governed those variables, all that information, exhaustive physical, complete information about that system, none of that would enable you to derive any conclusion about whether that system was experiencing anything, was having any feelings, and had any subjectivity. Now, of course, we sometimes conclude from the physically observable behavior of a being that it is having feelings. My late dog, Sparky, when he ate a piece of bacon, I think he was experiencing taste sensations and enjoying them. But suppose I denied that my dog, Sparky, did experience tastes or had any consciousness at all, or any subjective experiences at all. I would not be contradicting the laws of physics and chemistry to say that. And you could not prove me wrong from the laws of physics and chemistry. Such things as the taste of bacon or the scent of a lilac or the sensation of the color pink are not quantities, and the laws of physics and chemistry deal only with quantities, quantities that appear in equations and quantities that are measured. In other words, it isn't just that we don't yet know how to give a physics explanation of consciousness or sensory experience. It is that physics, by the very way it explains phenomena through mathematical and logical analysis, cannot in principle explain those things. Now, a person who recognized this was one of the founders of quantum mechanics, Erwin Schrödinger. He said in one of his books, all scientific knowledge is based on sense perceptions, but the scientific views of natural processes formed in this way lack all sensual qualities and therefore cannot account for the latter. Because our scientific views of those processes reduces them all to numbers and equations, and you can't get out of those numbers and equations the sensory experiences, or deduce that they exist. I'd like to quote another great physicist, one of our own day, Ed Witten. Many physicists regard Witten as the most brilliant theoretical physicist in the world. I think he is, and many people in my field would say that he is. He's agnostic as far as religion goes. But in an interview a couple of years, well, I think about 10 years ago, he was asked by a journalist whether he thought we'd eventually know all the laws of physics. Would we eventually know all the fundamental laws? And he was optimistic we would. And then he was asked by the journalist, do you think once we know all of the laws of physics, anything will remain mysterious? And he listed about 4 or 5 things that he thought would remain mysterious, and one of them was consciousness. He said, I tend to think consciousness will be a mystery. That's what I tend to believe. I tend to think that the workings of the conscious brain will be elucidated to a large extent. So I tend to believe that biologists, with perhaps physicists contributing, will understand much better how the brain works. But why something that we call consciousness goes with those workings, I think will remain mysterious. Perhaps I'm mistaken. I have a much easier time imagining how we'd understand the Big Bang, even though we can't do it yet, than I can imagine understanding consciousness. So the journalist didn't like this answer. He said, what do you mean by consciousness? Define consciousness. And Witten said, I'm not going to attempt to define consciousness. In a way, that is connected to the fact that I don't think it will become part of physics. I'm skeptical that it's going to become part of physics. Okay. But let's put the problem of consciousness aside. Let me now turn to another phenomenon that points to the falseness of materialism, our capacity to understand abstract concepts. That's an aspect of reason. So it's not something that animals have, but it's something that we have. And it is one of our spiritual powers, as I said, reason and free will. What is an abstract concept? Well, that's perhaps best explained by examples. If you think about a particular person, you're not thinking abstractly. But if you think about personhood, you are. Abstract terms such as personhood, or truth, or justice, or triangularity are what medieval philosophers called universal terms, universals. The word triangular, for example, is a universal because it does not refer just to this or that triangular thing, this piece of wood or that slice of cake, but to all real or possible triangular objects. Indeed, it can be understood apart from any concrete example of triangularity. You can think abstractly about it, even apart from seeing any triangular thing. When we understand the meaning of a universal term, apart from any particular object, we are engaged in truly abstract thought. Now, abstract thought has, in a sense, an unlimited reach. It transcends what is here and now and the particularities of specific objects to embrace a concept that is infinite in scope. For this reason, a philosophical tradition going back at least to Plato and Aristotle has argued that nothing which is merely material can engage in abstract thought. The argument is as follows. A particular material object or entity can exemplify an abstract concept the way a piece of wood or a slice of cake can exemplify triangularity. But no material object can exemplify all the ways of being triangular. Because, equilateral triangles, scalene triangles, right triangles, there's an infinite number of triangular shapes. A particular object cannot exemplify all of them. Or take the abstract concept of a mathematical function. The orbit of a planet around the sun or a comet around the sun may exemplify a specific mathematical function, such as a parabola or hyperbola in the case of a comet. But no particular material entity or system can exemplify all mathematical functions. So the full range of the abstract concept function cannot be inscribed or encoded in a particular material object or system. Therefore, it cannot be inscribed or encoded in the human brain. It's the same for any abstract concept. Thus, when the human mind understands an abstract concept or grasps the meaning of a universal term, something more than this lump of matter called the brain must be involved. That's the argument. Let's talk a little more about one type of abstract concept, those of mathematics, because they present several problems for materialists, as we'll see. Let's focus on a particular kind of mathematical concept, namely numbers. What are they? What is a materialist to make of numbers? The number 4, for example, or the number pi, or the 7th root of 19, or the square root of -1. These seem to have some kind of reality and objective character. We can think and speak about them, and we can make statements about them that are objectively true or false. Are they material objects? Obviously not. But maybe they are aspects or features of material objects. For example, one might think of the number 4 as an aspect of a 4-sided table or a 4-footed animal. Now that might work for numbers like 4, but it won't work for most numbers. For example, it won't work for the number pi or the 7th root of 19 or the square root of -1. It's hard to see how the 7th root of 19 can be an aspect of a material object. But if they're not aspects, if numbers are not material objects or aspects of material objects, then how do our physical brains know about them? If our brains are also just material objects. Some philosophers would answer this and say the way our brains, what numbers are is admittedly not material objects or aspects of material objects, but they're mental objects. You can't touch a number the way you can touch a table, but you can think a number. You can think about them. So numbers exist in the mind. They're mental phenomena. And I think this is true, but this is of no help to the materialist, because the materialist sees minds themselves as material things. Nothing more. The former editor of the science journal Nature wrote, "An explanation of the mind must ultimately be an explanation in terms of the way neurons function." And an article in Newsweek explained the implications of some neuroscience experiments this way: thoughts are not mere will-o'-the-wisps, ephemera with no physicality. They are instead electrical signals. So the mind is a lot of neurons, and thoughts are electrical signals, and that's it. So it's all just physical stuff. Well, if thoughts are electrical signals, and numbers are thoughts, then we have to conclude that the numbers pi and the 7th root of 19 are just electrical signals in someone's nervous system. And indeed, some would go that far. A science article in the New York Times some years ago said that, quote, numbers are neurological creations. So the seventh root of 19 is just something in your nervous system. It's something produced by your nervous system, an electrical phenomenon. So if all of mathematics and all of theoretical physics, including quantum mechanics, the theory of relativity, Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism, all of these equations are just electrical signals in the nervous systems of members of a certain species, that gives them no more status than a toothache. But we've already seen a fatal difficulty with this point of view. The full range of an abstract concept, such as numbers or functions and so on, cannot be inscribed in a particular finite material system, and that would include the nervous system. Now, an objection might occur to someone at this point. Don't we express mathematics in symbols and formulas written on paper or on blackboards or in electronic form in computers? Maybe mathematics is not a matter of abstract concepts and thoughts in a mind at all, but just a matter of the manipulation of symbols and formulas, which clearly can be inscribed in various material systems like pieces of paper, blackboards, and computer chips and microchips. So that's all math is. So math is not objects, it's not thoughts in the mind, which materialists think are also objects. No, but mathematics is just actually the numbers written on the paper or the blackboard. It's just those, and the manipulation of those. There is a school of thought in the philosophy of mathematics that takes this view, and it's called formalism, because it says that mathematics is just formulas and their manipulation. Now, there is some plausibility to it. After all, much of mathematics can be done by the mechanical manipulation of symbols. Think of what you do when you do long division. And that is why computers can do mathematical calculations and even mathematical proofs. I'll come back to this formalist idea very soon. But first I want to discuss another capacity of the human mind that causes severe difficulties for materialism. And that's our capacity, the mind's capacity, the human mind's capacity to grasp truth. The problem this raises for materialism is the following. If our thoughts simply follow a path laid out for them, set out for them by the laws that govern matter, as the materialist believes, then how does truth come into the picture? In the final analysis, my thoughts are the ones that I must have, given the way the laws of physics tell the molecules in my brain to move. In 1932, the famous biologist J.B.S. Haldane made the following argument. He said, if materialism is true, it seems to me that we cannot know that it is true. If my opinions are the result of the chemical processes going on in my brain, they're determined by chemistry, not by the laws of logic. Many other people have made the similar argument. For example, G.K. Chesterton, in his brilliant book Orthodoxy, written in 1908, noted that the materialist skeptic, he said, must sooner or later ask, quote, why should anything go right? Even observation and deduction. Why should not good logic be as misleading as bad logic if they're both movements in the brain of a bewildered ape? In fact, Darwin himself had wondered about this. So how is it we grasp truth if our thoughts are just molecules and electrons and things moving in accordance with these equations of physics? Now, interestingly, Haldane eventually reversed his position and came to embrace materialism, and what led him to change his mind was the development of the computer, which demonstrated that a machine, although bound by the laws of physics and just following the laws of physics, could also nonetheless follow the laws of logic. And you see, he was wondering earlier how our minds could follow the laws of logic if they're determined by chemistry. Well, computers can follow the laws of logic, and they're certainly just obeying laws of physics. Now, the reason Haldane ended up being misled is he did not frame the issue in quite the right way to begin with. The real issue is not whether a machine can follow the laws of logic. Of course it can. If it is designed and programmed properly, a machine that follows one set of rules, the laws of physics, can, by doing so, also follow another set of rules, the laws of logic or arithmetic or chess. The real question is whether a machine that only blindly follows rules of whatever kind can be open to the truth. And that's really what Haldane was originally worried about. Because he said, if materialism is true, he's saying, how can we know truth? And then he went off on a tangent. Now, the answer seems to be no. A machine that only follows rules blindly cannot be open to truth. To see this, let's restrict our attention to the realm of mathematics. Oh, and even in mathematics, openness to truth involves more than mere mechanical rule following. And that seems to be the lesson of one of the great discoveries of the 20th century, Gödel's theorem. Before the great logician Kurt Gödel proved his theorem or theorems in 1931, the school of thought called formalism, which I mentioned earlier, was very influential in the world of mathematics. According to the formalists, all of mathematical reasoning can be reduced to symbolic manipulations following prescribed rules. So all of mathematical thinking could be reduced to operations that a machine, such as a computer, could perform. Again, remember what you do when you do long division. You don't even have to be thinking. You mechanically follow certain rules. And they said all of mathematics can be reduced to that mechanical rule following, and so the computer could do it. So according to the formalists, to say that a mathematical proposition is true simply means that it can be derived from certain prescribed formulas called axioms by following these prescribed rules. Consequently, the following of mechanical rules could give one access to all mathematical truth, all true statements of mathematics. But in 1931, Gödel stunned the mathematical world and the philosophical world by showing that this view of mathematical truth is inadequate. He showed that no matter how many rules you lay down as axioms and how many rules for manipulating symbols that you lay down, there will always remain infinitely many truths of mathematics that cannot be reached merely by following those rules. Thus, even in the bloodless realm of mathematics, the power of reason and its ability to reach the truth involves something more than machine-like behavior. Computers can manipulate symbols by blindly following rules, but human minds do something much more profound. They grasp the meaning of those symbols and the truths implied by those meanings. Our thought processes are guided not only by rules, like logic or the rules of arithmetic, but by understanding as well, even in mathematics. That's why a calculating machine is not a mathematician. There's a statement that I haven't been able to track down who made it, but it's a horse that can count to 10 is a remarkable horse, but it's not a remarkable mathematician. If anyone finds out who said it, I thought it was Samuel Johnson, but I looked in the anyway, I'm unable to track it down. But that's the point. Understanding is not the same as following rules mechanically. So I'll now return to an argument in favor of materialism that has been very influential historically, as I mentioned earlier, namely the claim that the laws of physics are deterministic and leave no room for non-physical entities to affect the material world. So this brings me to quantum mechanics. In the 1920s, theoretical physics underwent a revolution. The whole conceptual foundation of physics changed in a profound way. And these new foundations, quantum mechanical foundations, to everyone's surprise, were non-deterministic. According to the fundamental principles of quantum mechanics, the state of a physical system at one time does not rigidly determine its future, contrary to what Laplace had famously said in 1819. Quantum mechanics tells you that the state of a physical system and the laws of physics only determine the relative probabilities of various different future outcomes. All of a sudden, one of the most powerful arguments against free will, which had made many people lose their faith in free will and in religion, was swept aside. In the words of the great mathematician Hermann Weyl, who also made very fundamental contributions to theoretical physics. Here we go, Hermann Weyl. In a lecture he gave in 1931 at Yale, he said, "We may say that there exists a world causally closed and determined by precise laws, but the new insight which modern quantum physics affords opens several ways of reconciling personal freedom with the laws of physics. It would be premature, however, to propose a definite and complete solution of the problem. We must await the further development of science, perhaps for centuries, perhaps for thousands of years, before we can design a true and detailed picture of the interwoven texture of matter, life, and soul. But the old classical determinism of Hobbes and Laplace need not oppress us longer." So he's saying, we don't have to worry about that anymore, because nature is not deterministic. Okay. So that's so an argument in favor of materialism has now been has been cut down by progress of physics. Now, the traditional way of understanding quantum mechanics has other powerful philosophical implications, and it leads to another. Quantum mechanics leads to another, or has been the basis of another powerful argument against the materialist view of the human mind. The traditional way, and I'm not going to try to go into a lot of detail, but if you're interested, you can go to my book, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, where there are several chapters explaining this. The traditional way of understanding quantum mechanics, which is called the orthodox interpretation of the standard or interpretation, or the Copenhagen interpretation, requires that there not only be physical systems that are measured, but someone doing the measurement, who is traditionally called the observer. So there's systems, and there's observers of those systems. The things being measured are physical, but the logic of quantum mechanics implies, according to some people, that the one doing the measurement, the observer, cannot be entirely physical. That is why no less a figure than Eugene Wigner, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, claimed that materialism, at least with regard to the human mind, is not, quote, logically consistent with present quantum mechanics. He wrote that in 1961, and we have the same quantum mechanics today. So he's saying materialism is not consistent with quantum mechanics. Another great physicist of the 20th century, Sir Rudolf Peierls, said, quantum mechanics implies, he said that quantum mechanics implies that, quote, the premise that you can describe in terms of physics the whole function of a human being, including his knowledge and his consciousness, is untenable. There's still something missing. So according to him, quantum mechanics implies you cannot reduce a human being entirely, including his knowledge, his mind, to physics. Now, I can very quickly explain why that is, and then I'm done. As I said, quantum mechanics is about probabilities of things happening. Pre-quantum physics, up until the 1920s, physics allowed you to calculate what is going to happen. Quantum mechanics says will only allow you to calculate the relative probabilities of things happening in the future. It's all about probabilities. Quantum mechanics is inherently about probabilities. But this leads to a conundrum. At some point, the probabilities of an outcome must give rise to a definite outcome. Or else the probability didn't mean anything in the first place. It makes no sense, for instance, to say that Jane has an 80% chance of passing the French exam. That statement is meaningless unless at some point Jane takes the French exam and either passes or fails. If she never takes the exam, what does it mean to say she has an 80% chance of passing it? So if you're talking about probabilities of outcomes, you have to have, at some point, a definite outcome. Well, here's the problem. In quantum mechanics, the equations, the laws of physics, don't give you definite outcome. They only give probabilities. What gives you the definite outcomes are the measurements or the observations. You observe something and you get a definite result. So the equations, the laws of physics, give you probabilities, but the measurements give you more than that, or the observations. The observer's activities give you a definite result. And that's a problem if you try to reduce the observer in toto, everything about the observer and everything that goes on when the observer makes a measurement or an observation. If you try to reduce all of that, describe it and explain it with the laws of physics, you end up with a problem, because once you try to explain everything with the laws of physics, you go back to just probabilities again, and you lose definite outcomes. You're trapped in a limbo of probabilities. This is called the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. And I think I quote Hans Halvorsen. No, I don't. I don't quote Hans Halvorsen. But for example, a distinguished philosopher of physics at Princeton University, Hans Halvorsen, says, in the case of quantum mechanics, if you presuppose physicalism, that everything is physical and described by physics, one quickly lands in the measurement problem. And so the last thing I want to say, so there's a powerful argument. This argument I'm presenting goes back to John von Neumann, one of the greatest mathematicians and scientists of the 20th century. And that I quoted a number of eminent people like Peierls and Wigner have agreed with him. Now, finally, I want to come to one of the simplest and most direct arguments against materialism, our experience of having free will. By which I mean, and traditionally people meant, a power of choosing among different possible actions in a given situation. There's one philosophical point on which most scientific materialists and Catholics agree. A purely material entity cannot have free will in that sense. Most materialists start with the idea that human beings are material entities and conclude that therefore they lack free will. Whereas believers in free will turn the argument around and conclude that because we do have free will, we're not completely material entities. Who has the stronger argument? I know, here's the difference between them. The materialist is making an argument based on a long chain, tenuous chain of abstract reasoning to conclude that we're material entities. And then from that he deduces we must not have free will. But the believer in free will doesn't have to rely on a long, tenuous chain of argument to know that he has free will. We know directly that we have free will because we exercise it. We know that we have the power of choice because we experience the power of choice. And once we know empirically, directly, that we have free will, then we conclude that we're not material entities, we're not entirely material. The 18th century writer Samuel Johnson put it this way. He was being pestered by his friend Boswell, who was a very extreme Calvinist. And Boswell was telling Samuel Johnson, who was a famous literary figure, you don't have free will. He was giving him all sorts of theological arguments that he didn't have free will. And Johnson said in exasperation, if a man should give me arguments that I cannot see, though I could not answer his arguments, should I believe that I do not see? And of course, he was right. You give me arguments that I have no free will. Am I to believe I have none? No, because just like sight, we experience it. So, this is the end of my talk, and I just want to sum up by saying there are many reasons to reject materialism. The phenomenon of consciousness, our ability to think abstractly, our openness to truth, our power of free will, and the problem of measurement in quantum mechanics. So just to repeat the teaching of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, In his openness to truth and beauty, his sense of moral goodness, his freedom, and the voice of his conscience, man discerns signs of his spiritual soul. The soul, the seed of eternity we bear within ourselves, irreducible to the merely material, can have its origin only in God. Thank you.